Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? Well, you're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support, and they're helping enterprises slash cost by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7, 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 companies and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is the smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started today. That's uscloud.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Hope everybody's having a good weekend or beginning of your week whenever you're listening to this show. I am recording this outside the normal studio, so apologize if there's any sort of background echo. Not the normal room with all the things to reduce that. But anyways, hope everybody's doing well. First off, I want to apologize for last week. We did not call out Mother's Day, which was by no means intended. Just kind of slipped past us. So apologize to all the mothers out there. We are thankful for what you do, and we appreciate everything that you do. I want to dive into a topic that we've talked about quite a bit on the show. I feel like we've talked about quite a bit for the last year and a half or so. As AI was starting to become more mainstream, we were all getting used to what it meant and what the technology was doing and all those sort of things. And I think we were looking for what were some of the early use cases, early things that people were really grasping onto, and that were starting to really start to take hold, especially within the enterprise in terms of use cases. And while we went through a number of them, one of them that really kind of jumped out was sort of developer co-pilots or developer assistants, whatever you wanted to call them. Essentially, the AI tools that were helping developers to write code, to better manage their code, to troubleshoot, all sorts of things. And, the initial feedback was, felt very good. A lot of developers were excited about it. They were beginning to use it. I know, every time we do a Cloud and AI News of the Month, Brandon Witcher talks about how he's a huge fan of it. And we've talked to lots of people who are very bullish on it. And then as we started to dig into it a little bit more and more information was coming out, more people were beginning to use it. They were starting to put out some information because a lot of times, the question, at least initially, as many things do in our industry, becomes, it starts off as being very binary. Okay, here's this new technology. Will it replace the previous thing? And in this case, it was, can these coding agents begin to replace the thing that they are augmenting, which was developers? And, that question, as with almost everything that we deal with in the enterprise is sort of a silly starting point, but it's where we start. And, then we started to see some numbers come out. And we were seeing, numbers that were coming out from people doing survey work, people doing analysis of their early adoptions and so forth. Then we saw a lot of, 10 to 20% productivity uplifts, 15 to 20%, maybe 25%. But numbers that weren't overwhelming. They were nice. Anytime you can get, a decent amount of productivity uplift, especially in a very short period of time, it's interesting. But, it also fell a little bit short of, some of the proclamations from the technology providers of saying, this is going to be 50% uplift, 40, 50, 60% uplift in terms of productivity. So, we had a initial moment of, yep, this seems like something that's going to work. We've begun to see some numbers come out. The numbers weren't necessarily as high as people thought. But then I think, we're still a year and a half, maybe 2 years into these sort of adoptions. And maybe if the uplift is, 10 to 20% on a yearly basis, then that becomes very, very interesting. We have begun to see some vendors, Microsoft in particular, Satya Nadella was doing an interview recently. And he said, somewhere between like 20 and 30% of their code is now being written by AIs. And, what he didn't really get into the details. People are curious. Does that mean like, Office 365 or, Power BI or something like that? Or is that like, internal stuff going on? Is that just CI/CD pipelines and so forth? But at least it was him putting a a number out there in terms of where they were, and then starting to kind of work off of that. So, again, we've seen some numbers out there. I think we're also beginning, I think, to understand, what does this mean? How should we even begin to measure this sort of space, right? Because development has always been a very difficult thing to measure. I know developers have always been, very particular about not necessarily, wanting to use one specific measure to identify what they had done or, put a value around what they did. In some cases, it used to be lines of code, and then it became, other types of things. So, this has always been an area that's been a little bit, difficult to necessarily like nail down exactly what, not what it's providing, but how do you best measure it, and how do you do it in a way in which you respect the fact that, while writing code, takes time and has become a very important thing. It's also something that is a piece of kind of the entire process of software. The other thing I think that we've sort of gone through, and this is where these numbers start to get interesting, because we're already starting to see some companies, not hire as many developers. In some cases, we've seen some layoffs, and it's hard to know whether that's seasonal or economic related, or if it's, companies beginning to wonder, do I need as many developers? And it's a big change. It feels like a big change from where we were, say, a decade ago, or even 5 or 6 years ago when COVID hit. But going back to things like when Stephen O'Grady from Red Monk wrote, software developers are the new kingmakers, that sort of seminal book that was out there, where I think we go back a decade or so, we were at the beginning of sort of this trend of digital transformation, in which software was going to eat the world, but it was going to define what your business experience was like, how your business managed data, how it managed collaboration internally, all sorts of things. And a lot of that's become normalized, right? It's become part of what every business has sort of gone through. Every company's had a decade or so to kind of do that. And I think to a certain extent, maybe what we're seeing is a little bit of also rationalization of, how much do we have to own in-house versus can be picked up by a third-party service, a SaaS service, if you will. How much should we be more efficient of the developers that we had in place? So I think all those dynamics are in play. As we look at the technology itself, one of the things that we've often asked is, how much should people be willing to pay for this, right? And this is, kind of the classic economics question of, I'm going to invest in new technology. What sort of benefit should I expect to get from it? Is 10 to 20% uplift good? Is that 10 to 20% per year? Is that 10 to 20% over 3 to 5 years? And then you sort of manage the, how much additional investment am I making for that 10 to 20% or whatever the uplift is, right? And so we sort of questioned, as we often do during early cycles, what should people be paying for these types of technologies, and then what should those companies be valued at, right? And we've started to see companies like Cursor, who recently had a $9 to $10 billion valuation based on some funding rounds. Recently saw Windsurf was acquired by OpenAI for $3 billion. So, you begin to sort of go, okay, at least some numbers are out there. We're starting to see what people are paying for. Oftentimes the early adopters are going to pay a premium above and beyond because they're trying to gain first mover status and so forth. So, all those things are sort of going on. And then we can overlay that with, the beginning of seeing more and more adoption, more and more evolution of agents, right? So not just assisting developers, but beginning to see that next stage where, you sort of ask, what could be done autonomously? What could be done with fleets of sort of non-human AIs going off and doing a bunch of tasks? And we're seeing lots of companies launching agent frameworks. We're seeing lots of open source frameworks out there. So this is a space that is rather interesting. There is, economic value being identified. There is investment happening in this space. It's not exactly what people expected, but I think, we are going through a change of, a previous sort of era in which we placed a ton of emphasis on developers, and again, those developers didn't necessarily want to be measured in certain ways. They just wanted to be able to write code and do new things and be 10x developers. I think this is the normal rationalization that we're seeing, and we're also seeing the rationalization because we have a new generational technology that's really kind of bringing into question how fast should your overall software development happen, right? Like, what should your software development, whether it's a factory or whatever it might be, how should that work? And we're beginning to have those conversations, I think, taking developers out of the equation. Not so much as like, should we replace them, but overall, what should that thing look like? What should the role of developers be? What should the role of AIs be? And I think that's the sort of next stage that we're beginning to get into. And I think that conversation is ultimately leading, why we're seeing some of these high valuations, why we're seeing Google and Amazon and others, begin to put out rumors that they expect to be, creating their own assistants here pretty soon and will be available in market. We'll probably see others as well. We'll see smaller startups, start to be in this space. And so it really got me thinking, where does this go next, right? Is the next stage of this really just the playing out of, widespread adoption of sort of enhanced developer productivity, right? So do we just see this market sort of mature? Do we begin to see, better understanding that, these tools should be helping developers productivity at, say, 20 to 25% per year, right? As some sort of baseline, just sort of throwing a number out there. Or do we begin to see this really take a different frame of view, frame of vision, frame of opportunity, and again, begin to look at this as not just how many developers do you need, or what kind of tools should you be using, or what framework should you be using, but if software is still a differentiator for the business, but it's also something that is foundational to the business, what should that look like? How can we be more efficient? How can we better, leverage the ability to bring in innovation? Kind of some bigger picture thinking. And what really got me rethinking this space, as opposed to just thinking like, what will be Cursor 2.0 or Windsurf 2.0 or Copilot 2.0, whatever that would be, was I had a conversation with a couple of CEOs, CTOs recently, larger companies, and what they were laying out for me was their way of thinking about this. And what they were really thinking about this was they were saying, instead of looking at it from a increased productivity perspective, they were really asking themselves, if we started to take the limitations out, right? If they said, hey, how much software could we create, and what could that mean for our business? Whether it means new capabilities, new products, new ways to get into market. They were looking at it holistically, and they said, if we took some of the constraints out of it, in terms of forget about the number of developers we're dealing with, forget about the cost of those developers, forget about all of the interpersonal communications and the amount of kind of overhead that implies when you've got multiple teams and multiple ways of doing integrations and all these sort of things. What could we start to think about? And they were really beginning to talk about this idea of, instead of having multiple layers of, traditional managers, team managers and project managers and directors or VPs kind of overseeing a lot of different stuff. And then all of the kind of human interaction that goes along with that, as well as all of the sort of human opinion that goes along with developers picking which language and tools and databases and whatever it might be. They started to say, hey, what if we started to think more like, we have a set of people that are very smart, whether these are project leads or senior developers or whatever they might be. What if we began to give them resources that looked like fleets of AIs, right? Or augmented certain work that they did with fleets of AIs, right? And this is where we begin to see sort of that next sort of steps begin to evolve themselves, right? Because the first sort of baby step out of that thinking is, do you start to see specialized functions within developer workflows that are really targeted by a set of AI tools, right? Whether it's CI and CD pipelines, whether it's documentation, whether it's security evaluations, bug fixes, long-term maintenance, right? Like imagine, do you need to continue to keep, very valuable people employed just to do long-term maintenance? Or could you begin to, essentially offshoot that to, a team of autonomous things just dealing with bug fixes and patches and regression testing and all that kind of stuff? So that was the first sort of half step they talked about. But the second step really became that thing where they said, number one, we oftentimes have very, very smart people who get frustrated. They're very smart. They are senior technical people. They've done very good work over time. They've evolved to become, again, senior dev, an architect, a team lead, whatever it might be. And they don't necessarily want to go into the management chain. They don't necessarily want to focus more on soft skills than their hard skills. And, they began to ask themselves, well, what if those people now had a new path? And that path was, managing resources, managing allocation, managing outputs. But those outputs were more focused around agentic services, right? Sort of agents, if you will. And, begin to sort of spark an interesting conversation of, could that person manage 10 AIs? Could they manage 100 AIs? So that was sort of the first one, because then now you're starting to get into, they can potentially do, instead of doing 8-hour days or 12-hour days, they're doing 24-hour days, instead of having to worry about language barriers or worrying about, personal opinions upon stuff, or, kind of all the intercommunication and collaboration that goes on. Could that become just orchestrated work, right? So that was one thing they were starting to look at in terms of breaking down barriers or limitations that previously had been there, right? That were human oriented, right? Whether it was, where do we find people? How do they best collaborate? How are they measured? How do we spend time, kind of negotiating between their preferences of stuff, all those sort of things. And then the second thing became, maybe it's not, like I said, it's not initially fleets, but then it became, well, could they do more, right? Is this a good thing or a bad thing to start thinking this way? And the second piece that came along was, okay, so now we've started to think in terms of what's possible, having removed certain previous limitations that we had, which were things like, could we afford those people? Were those people in the right place? Could we find enough people that knew our existing code base versus, this new code base that we had? So all those sort of things. And the next thing they started thinking about was, well, because there's so much innovation out there, there's so much technology out there, and oftentimes we can't take advantage of all of it because it's hard to find people to do it. It's hard to figure out, how would we deal with this? What would our learning curve be? And if we have to kind of go through all those processes, are we going to miss the window to take advantage of this? And so it became, they started to think about, what would it look like to begin to do greater experimentation for things, right? Oftentimes it's not hard to find somebody who went, oh, a new thing came along, I spun something on my laptop, but you don't really get a chance to experiment with it because that learning curve plus all the possibilities just takes a good amount of time. And so what would happen if you think about project managers asking for things, you're building stories against whatever you're trying to build, instead of getting, one or two prototypes or one or two, minimum viable types of things, what if you got 10 or 15 or 20 or 100, sort of options at that, right? Those options oftentimes are very, very expensive. They take a bunch of time. They take a bunch of resources. People try and, guess what's going to be best, but oftentimes they guess what's going to be best based on, the few options that are given to them. What happens if we begin to see greater experimentation? Because, again, these autonomous resources can build options very quickly. As we've seen just in using, ChatGPT tools, you can say, hey, write me something, but write it in a more humoristic way, in a more serious way, in a way in which it's going to be more attention grabbing. Well, you could imagine those same sort of things being, okay, let's build this feature, let's build this user experience, let's build this one. So it's more geared towards a Gen X crowd versus a millennial crowd versus one in which, the behavior is going to look something like this. And those can often be very difficult if you are, dealing with human restraints of time and, capabilities and all those things. But could you begin to do more and more of those and, potentially either get to a better solution faster through more experimentation, or begin to realize that you could, further segment what you build to be more specific to cater to certain audiences, right? And so, that was an interesting, viewpoint that they were looking at is this isn't really a replacement of human beings, but really an augmentation of of the possibilities of what could be for your business, right? So that was sort of the second area that they were really kind of digging into. The third was, do we start to see, teams, companies, organizations begin to build out these skunk works in the same way, or centers of excellence, the same way we saw when people were doing this with, building cloud native tools or DevOps or other things, a decade ago, where it was like, well, this stuff is going to be very different from what we're used to, kind of in the Gartner, kind of bifurcated mode that they talk about, mode 1 and mode 2, or bimodal. Do we begin to see companies, building or creating or incentivizing somebody to go see what's possible with this, right? And I could very much see this happening, in which, somebody goes to one of the senior engineers who maybe is frustrated, doesn't necessarily want to be put down the management track, and says, hey, I want you to take 6 months or 9 months or whatever it might be, and I want you to go experiment in the space and see what you could create, see what's possible, see what systems would need to be put in place to make this to make this real, right? So I'd be very curious to start to see if we begin to see if we start to see those types of things starting to emerge. And the last thing that we really kind of discussed, again, in the context of, are things going to be, what could be different if we started to remove some of those things? Oftentimes we'll talk to product managers and they will be, they'll be frustrated because the number of things that they're trying to do isn't happening fast enough, or they don't have enough engineers to keep up with the number of requests that customers are making of a feature, or internal users, want to make changes, or, oh, it would be great if we could move into this new market with this new technology, but we just don't have all the tools or anything, whatever is needed to get there. And it'll be very interesting to see if, we start to get to this point where we can build things faster, we can build more prototypes of things better or faster, we can build more experimentations faster. What happens when that backlog goes to zero for product managers, right? Are they prepared to start to think faster about ideas? Are they prepared to take feedback from the marketplace faster? Are they prepared to come up with, directional variations that could happen in that space, right? So I think what was really interesting to me is the way that this sort of next generation thinking sort of wasn't looking at it purely from a, replace humans or augment humans. It really was, if we look systematically at building software and that software being, for expanding the business, reaching new markets, giving a more catered experience to things, all that kind of stuff. What does that mean in terms of our thinking? What are the barriers today that are holding that back? What are the things that, we could begin to do if those barriers weren't there? And I think that combination of new way of thinking about it, along with these new tools that are beginning to emerge and the standards are beginning to emerge around them and all that sort of stuff, really starts to paint an interesting picture of potentially what's next for this, next age for developers, right? And it gets you away a little bit from the developers should be worried for their job kind of thing. And that's every person that's working with AI has that potential kind of shadow hanging over their head or cloud hanging over their head. But I think when you begin to think about it in terms of not just binary one for one, replace or augment, but you begin to think a little bit more systematically, it does get into some very interesting thought processes. And I think it begins to, in the same way that, we saw multiple decades ago where people were rethinking how like automobiles were built, or how, factories were organized around end results, but optimizing in every single layer. I think we're going to start to see that in ways that we didn't necessarily see when we were first talking about, kind of the factory automation in the same context as developers. But I think now that we have the ability to have autonomous systems in places that we didn't necessarily have the ability to do that, or systems that could, produce much more, much faster, whether those are experiments or real life, with certain constraints being taken out of them, I think it becomes very, very interesting. So anyways, just something to think about. Would love to hear people's feedback on, where they think the space is going beyond just, like I said, Cursor 2.0 or Copilot 2.0. We'll be very interested to hear, kind of where your thought processes are, maybe where your companies are with this stuff, and definitely an area that we'll be continuing to cover on the show going forward. So With that, thank you all for listening. Thank you for telling a friend. Thank you for helping us spread the word about the show and get it out to new communities. And with that, I will wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.